introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight and your willingness to support Christ's home and the kids and the seniors that Christ's home takes care of for us. As you all know now, my name is Nathaniel Deen, and I am employed at Sight and Sound Theaters, and I love what I do. That video we just wanted to show you, that's kind of the things that I do. I work with an incredible team, and I love them, and it's an honor to work and continue the ministry. And so I'm just so honored to be here tonight to share my story with you. And I just want to start by saying that it is a story that is raw and real, and I'm going to share it that way because I feel that the Lord wants me to tell it as it happened, as it is, as it was, so that you might know that there is hope for the hopeless. So let me start with this. Many years ago, a young boy, just 6 years old, sits in the back seat of his grandmother's car. She is driving up a long tree-lined driveway. The boy notices a sign that reads, "Home for Children." He could see the tears in his grandmother's eyes in the rearview mirror. She came to a stop at the large building at the top of the hill, and the boy's grandmother opened his door, took his hand, and walked him over to a woman that was waiting for him. None of this he understood. His grandmother knelt beside him and pulled him in tight and said that she was sorry and that it wasn't his fault. She got back in her car and drove away. And as that car drove away down the lane, he ran after it crying because he felt all alone in this very strange place. That little boy who was left at the doorsteps of an orphanage, who no longer had a family, was me. And I'm here to tell you an incredible story of a boy who lost everything, but by the grace of God, found a family of his own. A true tragedy to triumph story. It's the story of two people from two different walks of life coming together and finding light in the darkness. It's an extraordinary story, in fact, that is being made into a full-length feature film called Brave the Dark. My journey in life would have been a different outcome if it were not for Stan Deen, a local high school teacher who stepped out of his comfort zone and planted a seed of hope in my life when I was a hopeless teen. My life had been filled with hopeless moments, but it all started when I was just 5 years old. I don't have any good memories of my parents. They were always arguing, and my father was very abusive. My mom had had enough and was trying to get away from him, but even the police couldn't keep her safe. One day I was playing in the front yard of my house, and my father pulled in the driveway, and he was very angry. And he picked me up and asked me where my mother was. And I said to him that I'm going to have a new dad. And in an instant, his eyes got really red and he got very, very, very mad. And he put me down and I fell to the ground. And he ran into the house, yelling for my mother. He ran up the steps and he said, get out here, get down to me. He yelled at my mother. And she said, "No, let me alone." And he grabbed her by her hair and he drug her down the steps and he took her outside to the car. And I don't know why, but I followed them. And he pushed her head up against the window and made her look inside the car. And I don't know why, but I climbed up on the back bumper and looked in the window and I saw a gun. That's hunting rifle. And he said, "This is what I have for you." My mom screamed and she pulled away. And she managed to get away and started to run. And he very calmly pulled the gun out, loaded it around, cocked the gun, and watched her run towards the house. And I followed her because she yelled, "Come follow me, get in here, get away." And she's screaming and she gets to the front porch and she goes in through the door. And I, for some reason, stopped and wouldn't follow her in. And she stopped at the window and opened the window. And my dad saw her, and he pulled the gun, and he shot her. And I heard the glass explode, and my mom fall to the floor, and I went inside, and I opened the door, and I saw her laying on the floor. And I walked up to my mother, and I leaned down to her, and I picked her head up in my arms, and I said, "Mommy, no." I heard my dad come in, and so I ran and hid behind the couch. And I saw my mom take her last breath. And just to be sure, my dad pulled the gun again and shot her in the head. And he walked outside. And he went to the porch, and I don't know how long I hid behind that couch. And the tears were just rolling down my face. And I had no idea what was going on. I'm just 5 years old. I heard my father walking out on the porch. And for some reason, I opened the screen door and walked out. And he was crying. And he was pacing back and forth, very disturbed finally. He knew what he had done. And in the distance, we heard sirens. The neighbor had called the cops. And he looked at me, and he looked at the gun, and he looked at me. He said, "I'm sorry, son, but if I can't have her, then no one's going to have her." And then he took the gun, and he put it in his mouth, and he turned around, and he pulled the trigger. And I yelled, "No!" as the blood went all over me. The next thing I remember, trying to open my eyes, and I just couldn't. But I could kind of see my father laying on the ground. And I went back inside, and I looked at my mom one more time. And I went upstairs and sat on the bed, and I didn't know what to do. And I don't know how long I sat there until a man in a uniform came in and said, "Follow me now." And so he took my hand and he led me down the steps. And people were holding blankets over my mom and my dad. And the neighbor lady took me. She took me next door to her house, to her mudroom. And she had an old galvanized tub, metal tub with old galvanized tubs. And I was covered in blood. And she put me in that tub, and she put warm water in the tub, and she poured water over my head, trying to get rid of the blood. And as she did, she began singing "This Little Light of Mine." And she sang it over and over and over until that blood was gone. And that song means the world to me today. This very real darkness tried desperately to destroy me from a very early age. No child should ever witness the horrors that I saw that day. And I can tell you right now that I'm not the only kid that deals with these things. Maybe not to this extent, but there's a lot of abuse. There's a lot of neglect, not knowing where your next meal's coming from. But that's where earlier the story I had talked about my grandmother driving up the lane to Christ's home in paradise. She felt she was too old to care for me and thought that another family would do a better job. But it was a major adjustment for me. I was alone, and the tragedy affected me in so many ways. But the biggest way was that I wouldn't speak. I just went silent, completely silent for 2 full years. And all I would do is this, or yes. And in fact, some of the other kids in the orphanage would speak for me because they knew we didn't come in candy or food or things that I liked. But I was so traumatic that I couldn't do it. I could not talk. I didn't want to talk. I had nothing to say. But I will say that my time at Christ's home, though it was only 3 years, was a safe place. And you don't know how much that means to a kid when they have no idea what's going on. And so, my wife and I give every year because we don't want a kid to have to feel unsafe, no matter where they live. And sadly, I don't have many memories of Christ's home, just that it was safe. And that I had some fun with the kids, but yeah. And so this is where the story takes a little bit of a weird turn. I don't want to get into all the details, but not every adoption is wonderful. It can start out wonderful, it can go far, it can be a lot of things, but it wasn't great for me. And I ended up growing up moving from foster home to foster home because people just didn't know how to deal with me. I wouldn't talk, I wouldn't speak, I wouldn't do anything. And so they just didn't know what to do with me, so I moved from foster home to foster home. And in those foster homes, I was told I was never going to be anybody. You're a loser. They told me how my parents died. Oh, they died in a car accident. There was just a lot of adults lying to me. And that wasn't something that I wanted to in my life. I didn't believe or trust adults. And so my childhood was pretty much stripped from me. And many more times of hardship and loss affected my life in the years to come. And soon, sad to say, I was a very rebellious teenager. I felt that the world owed me and that I wasn't going to stop complaining until I got back all that I felt that I deserved. God, why is all of this stuff happening to me? Really? If you're real, why is this stuff happening to me? But little did I know, a small town school teacher would come into my life and change it forever. And that is where my turning with Stan began. It was the summer of 1986. I decided to run away from the last foster parents, and they never reported me missing. They never really loved me the way a child should be loved. And I knew I was probably better off on my own. I had worked a summer job flipping burgers at Wendy's and saved enough money to buy a 1970 Camaro, which is the worst car to buy because I couldn't afford gas. But I began to live in that car, parking in dark places around New Holland, Lancaster, hiding from people, lying to girlfriends, lying to the school, lying to everybody. Everyone thought, oh, he's fine. He has a place to go. I ran track in the mornings just so I could take a shower and wash my clothes. No one knew. But I got in a lot of trouble. Because when you're on your own, and no one seemed to want to help this young man, and the only ones that did were like, hey, you got a car, let's go do something. And so we started smoking, drinking, drugs, stealing, anything I needed to get food, because I had no food. If I wasn't staying at a friend's house, there was nothing. So one day I woke up in my car in the middle of a cornfield. That's because where I had to hide, and I was starving. I hadn't eaten in 3 full days, like nothing. And I was really, really hungry. And I realized that I was just this tall, skinny, homeless teenager living out of my car, and I had no real purpose and little to no hope. But one day, after I said I hadn't eaten for several days, I scavenged the vending machines at the school hallway, hoping to find anything. But I ended up walking into a class called the Bible as Literature, because that was the only way you could teach the Bible. Was literature, so we could teach it in English. It was an English class. At the door, as he would every day, Mr. Deen smiled and greeted me. But this day, seeing that I didn't look quite right, he reached into his desk drawer And he took out a huge Hershey's chocolate bar. And he offered it to me, saying, on behalf of the school social committee, which there is one, I am awarding you this delicious chocolate bar. Wow. I couldn't believe it. It was the biggest thing I've ever seen, and I ate the whole thing in like 30 seconds. It was incredible. As the other kids were coming in, I ate it and I sat there, and I think later on he even gave me a couple of bucks to get some lunch. But right, it's just a candy bar. Big deal. But that small act of kindness planted a seed of hope and initiated a bond that would last for more than 30 years. At this point, Mr. Deen was just a teacher, but that relationship would soon begin to grow with more significance as he continued to recognize and try to meet a need in me. I really wasn't a good kid, and I got in a lot of trouble. We robbed a couple of places, nothing big, businesses were closed, but still we knew we were doing wrong. And I soon found myself being arrested in my classroom, in front of my students, in front of my girlfriend, and being taken out in handcuffs as Stan watched me. And he had no idea. And I found myself at Lancaster County Prison. And if you know the Lancaster County Prison, it looks like a castle. But it wasn't on my bucket list to see. One day, after spending several weeks in jail, I was told that there was a visitor there to see me, and I walked down the hall to a room divided by plexiglass with 2 phones on either end. And on the other side of the glass, I saw Mr. Deen. And I wept. I thought he was there to yell at me, just like every other adult. I thought I was in trouble, even more. And I said, Mr. Deen, are you here to yell at me? He said, oh my gosh, no. I'm here to find a way to get you out. You don't belong here. Even if you've done these things, you don't belong here. Before he left, he shared a scripture verse with me. Isaiah 40:30-31. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings of eagles, and they will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. I can tell you at the time I didn't understand what this meant. But it was my first sign of hope. I cried even more. I couldn't understand why he would want to help me. Why would a teacher come to prison to visit me? When everyone else was saying, let the system take care of that kid, Stan said no. And he got involved in my life. I was bailed out, and in an effort to get me back to school, Stan offered me a place to stay, just on his couch, just for a few days until we could figure out something. But from that moment on, we became family. I was the son he'd never had, and he was the father that I needed. But our early relationship was quite literally Barbra Streisand versus Metallica, right? We were from 2 different walks of life. He tried to get through to me, but I continued to make bad choices. But his constant presence and persistence made the difference for me. He never gave up. He never judged. He always encouraged and brought out the best in me. He believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. I want to take a quick moment just to share this quick story. This is just the kind of man he was and the things that he did that I think most parents would be like, yeah, whatever. It was a couple days before my birthday, and I was pretty miserable because I never really celebrated my birthday, or I never really celebrated Christmas my whole life. And so I didn't want to celebrate my birthday. And I was really struggling emotionally, and Stan said, hey, what do you want to do for your birthday? You know, let's have a party, let's do all this stuff. And I said, no, I don't want a birthday party, I don't want a birthday cards, I don't want any of it. I don't want a birthday cake, absolutely no birthday cake. But I didn't know that Stan had already purchased a really big birthday cake. A really big birthday cake. He must have panicked at first when I told him I didn't want that cake. But as typical of Stan, he came up with a brilliant plan. When I arrived home that evening after a long day of work, he was waiting for me. He asked me to sit at the dining room table. A moment later, he entered the room holding this massive cake, and he placed it down in front of me. And as he was doing it, I yelled at him, "Stan, I told you I don't want a birthday cake." And in his giddy little voice, he said, "But it's not a birthday cake. It's a happy day cake." I looked down at it, and in fact, the cake read, "Happy Day, Mate." Earlier that day, he had taken the cake back to the bakery and had them change it. I looked up at Stan and I told him that he was the weirdest person I had ever met. He laughed and he said, "Nate, more than anything else, I just want you to be happy today." Wow. Don't we all need happiness in our lives? Stan's continued patience and unconditional love gradually broke through my hardened heart. I credit him and God for the man that I am today. But sadly, the story isn't over. I had a major setback. Teen boys having a girlfriend that breaks up with them is not a good thing. Her dad didn't want to date the bad kid. And so I decided I wanted to get trashed. It was my way of pushing my feelings of loss away so that I didn't have to deal with it. Stan went away for the weekend, and I thought I'll just have a couple of friends over. A couple of friends turned into 45 friends. Beer cans, smoking, drinking. At one time the keg blew up and sprayed 2 inches of beer all over the floor. And I kicked everyone out, and I said, "Oh my gosh, Stan is going to kill me." And so I spent 4.5, 5 hours cleaning, but didn't even make a dent. And Stan walked into the house the next day. And I came up from the basement with all these buckets and trying to clean stuff. And he said, "I can't even look at you right now. All of the things that I've done for you, and this is what you give back." And he had every right to be mad at me, but I thought he was kicking me out. Every other adult that I knew would have done that. And so I quickly grabbed a couple of things and left the house. And didn't realize that Stan was yelling for me to stop, that he was just upset that we would figure things out, and that he cried for hours after I left. Because he knew that I would probably get into even more trouble, and in fact I did. I ended up at another party, and now I'm sitting there going, now I've just thrown everything I love away. And so I drank a lot more beer, I did some LSD, and I started having what they call a bad trip. I started imagining things that weren't happening. And I started walking down the middle of the road. Luckily it was 2 a.m, no cars. I started getting hot, and I started taking all of my clothes off, all the way to my boxers. And I got to a bridge, some 60-foot drop, and I decided at that moment that I was done with life. There was no purpose. I had lost Stan, the one thing that meant something to me, the last of the hope. And I looked down, and it looked pretty shallow, and I said, "Oh, it'll go fast." And I jumped. The next thing I remember, thankfully, is someone pulling me out of the water, taking me to the hospital, them pumping my stomach, them doing all sorts of tests to figure out what's wrong with me. And in fact, my heart stopped for 2 minutes, but they managed to get it back. None of this stands just hoping that I'm okay. But I woke up the next morning and my parole officer was there waiting for me. And by all means, I should have gone back to jail that very moment. But I felt the Lord speak, I guess. I heard a voice, something that said, just tell him your story. Just tell this parole officer what you've been through. Don't use it as an excuse. Accept whatever he's going to give you. And so I told him the whole thing. And I said, listen, I don't know what to do. I need help. I really, really need help. And he said, I think you know who you need to call. And he was right. He gave me one more chance, and I knew what I needed to do. I called Stan and asked him if I could come home. And he said, Nate, come home. I went home to ask him for forgiveness, my prodigal son moment. And yes, Stan was standing there waiting with open arms to welcome me home. He told me that I needed to decide if I really wanted to change my life, or did I still want to blame my past? The world's not going to give you anything, Nate. You got to fight for it. I made a big decision that day. I decided that I wanted a change, and that I wanted to brave the darkness of my past and all of the bad decisions. And Stan took me to my dad's grave. And I was able to forgive my dad. And I told my dad that he was no longer going to influence my life, that he didn't deserve that. But more importantly, I forgave myself. I forgave myself for all the things that I thought were my fault. I wanted to move forward toward a future that would lead to happiness and fulfillment. And Stan, in his unconditional love, would be there to help. And I became strong because of him. I was able to press through the challenges. They weren't always easy, as Glenn said. But my most recent challenge is facing the world without him, because he passed away in 2016. The reason we asked Glenn and Shirley here tonight is because they played a huge role in helping me become the man that I am today. This is the part of the story where they came into my life. I had just finished my final sentence in jail that summer, and literally walked out of prison for the last time. It was a Friday afternoon, and Stan took me to Sight and Sound Theaters, the Living Waters Theater, the original one, where he was directing this show called Behold the Lamb, the story of Jesus' life. I walked into the lobby and met Glenn and Shirley and asked Glenn for a job. He took me up to the catwalk on one of the side stages, and he showed me a spotlight. He said, do you know how to run one of these things? And I said, no. He said, well, just hold it steady, open up the light, follow the person. He said, in 1 minute, there's going to be a guy that comes out on the one side. He's going to be in a white costume, and I want you to follow him the whole way across the stage, and then he's going to come up the side stage. Little did I know that I was following the character of Christ. That is where my journey of getting to know the real Jesus began, was at Sight and Sound. After a couple of months of seeing Glenn and Shirley and the rest of the Sight and Sound team living for Christ and speaking truth into my life, Glenn led me to the Lord in his van. Glenn, it was 100 degrees. But it was July 28th, 1989. But it was at that moment that I realized that God was with me when my parents died. He was with me when I was at Christ's home. He was with me when I was in prison. He had always been with me. And he continues to guide my life, every aspect of my life. Jeremiah 29:11 says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. So that's my story, and it's going to be made into a film because I think it's a pretty incredible testimony of a man helping a helpless teen and us both coming out of that darkness. We braved the darkness together. And our film is shot. We shot it in Lancaster County last September. My wife and I were on the crew, and I was a producer for it. And I wrote it, got a lot of other people involved, really great people. And it is now in post-production, and we're excited to get it out to the world. Hopefully it'll premiere this fall in theaters across the country. And our hope for the film is that the audience would be inspired by the message of hope and redemption. And let me tell you a real quick story before I finish. Jess and I were standing at what they call the video village, which is where the monitors are for those that are producers and different things. And so we get to watch what's being shot. And we're standing there and we're watching the scene where Stan's helping this boy named me. And he's helping him through this really tough situation. And one of the crew members came over and he was influenced by this. He's like, man, I don't understand how someone can be a better father to someone not related to him than I am to my own son. Wow. We don't even have the story out, it's already affecting people in a positive way. I was out in LA recently to watch the first cut that the director did. He's so excited to show it to me. He's like, come out. So I got to go out and I got to watch it. And there were several other people there and they got to watch it. And at the end, as everyone was leaving, almost every one of them said, man, I want to be a better person after watching that. I want to be Stan. I want to help. How do I help? What do I got to do? It was really awesome. Let me finish with this. Each and every one of us can have a large and profound impact on the lives of those around us. There is an amazing power that can be unleashed by reaching out a helping hand to someone in need. I want to pass on something Stan did for me. As you leave here today, there's a Hershey chocolate bar for all of you. I don't want you to eat it. If you want to, you can. But really what I want you to do is I want you to tell my story to someone in need and give them that chocolate bar. That you got to know someone in your life that needs help. It doesn't even have to be a big problem. Just even a hello. Maybe they're not feeling well. Maybe they're in the hospital. But I want to do that for you because someone amazingly did that for me. I want you to remember how something as simple as this chocolate bar, an act of kindness, gave me hope and changed my life forever. You know, my testimony is really, really big. But it just takes the little things to get you to where you need to go sometimes. It doesn't have to be something big. The little things do matter. Our actions matter. No matter how small, have a ripple effect and can indeed change the world. In order for people to find their way out of the darkness, they have to find light. And I hope that as you leave here today, you seek opportunities to be the light. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for sharing your story with us tonight, encouraging us and inspiring us. I want to present you today with the 2022 Legacy Leadership Award, presented to Nathaniel, Deen, in appreciation for your leadership in life, the community, and the Christian faith. 2 Timothy 3:16-17 says this: all scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. We praise God for the good works that He is doing in your life.